This really is a wonderful book that Josh Chin and Liza Lin have written. And it comes, I think, at a really important time and relationship between China and the world. Because I think it is a kind of a personification of what we usually look at as an ideological division. And what they've really done so beautifully is to limn for us what techno-autocracy looks like. And having just finished the book, I have to say, it's quite alarming that this is something that the world really has not seen before. But they've done it in a very artful way because they've also reminded us, and sort of, Lisa, I think you did the part, the kind of the optimistic part of techno-autocracy, and Josh, you did the sort of pessimistic part, Xinjiang and other things. But a reminder that, you know, this is very effective both in suppression and in making society work and making governments connect in a strange way with people. So we want you to talk about that. But just to get us rolling, you all once were reporters in China. Now you're not. You're living outside. You've been kind of defenestrated. Tell us how you got into this thing, and when you left China and you were in the middle of your project, how did that all sit and how did you work through it? Let's start with you, Lisa.
Sure. I guess the project started. The genesis of the book was a series of stories that Josh and I did for the Wall Street Journal in 2017. Back then we were thinking about, Josh had the idea of exploring writing a series of stories about state surveillance, but we weren't exactly sure what the angle was. We just knew that, you know, Chinese society in general was being watched in many more areas, but what was the best way to tell this story? And we stumbled on it in a very, I guess, Wall Street Journal fashion. And I say that because we essentially were following the money. I was a tech reporter in Shanghai back then, looking at startups and venture capital into China. And there was a ton of money going into one particular niche technology space. And money had never gone into this space before. It was often into like hardware, or back at that time, the internet was the hot thing. And suddenly I saw a diversion of money into AI, and it wasn't just, you know, the entire subsets of AI. It was into one particular area, and that was like facial recognition. That's when I pursued a couple of startups, and I said, can we go down and see what you're doing? And Josh and I, we managed to nail an interview at that point with SenseTime, possibly SenseTime's first foreign media interview. And when they welcomed us into their office, we immediately knew we were onto something. Like when you walk into their office, the first thing you do is to scan your face. Like nobody uses a pass to tap in. Like everyone was scanning their face. And back then, this was like 2017. So it wasn't as commonplace as you see in China right now. So the employee that let us in scanned his face, and we walked in, and the first thing you see is like several screens taking up the wall right in front of us. There were probably 12, plasma screens stuck together, and they were live streaming a scene from just a street corner outside of SenseTime's office, where Josh and I had just walked past. And every single individual car or object was labeled. Like you can imagine square, colorful boxes with little labels on it, like female person, red shirt. If it was a car, it would be Toyota, which model, which year of production even. And then we were like, oh my gosh, that was so much data collection in one single screen, and that's kind of when we knew we were onto something.
Josh.
Yeah, so, just Liza did, I remember very clearly when Liza came to me with this, because, at the time, the genesis of our interest in this topic was a really sort of tectonic shift in the Communist Party's orientation towards Chinese people, right? So for decades, I've been in China, Orville knows because he was a mentor of mine early on, but I've been in China for 15 years or more, and when I first started going, the Communist Party was in this process of pulling back from society, of pulling themselves away from the managing the personal lives of Chinese people. And this was, around 2016, 2015, you saw that reversing, right? And increasingly the Communist Party was, telling people how to live their lives, taking a bigger interest. There were more security guards on the street. There were more residential committee members prying into what people were doing. And so we knew that this was happening. And so when Liza took me along to visit this company, and they told us, these are technologies they were selling to police, right? And it was clear that this was a sort of a new level. It was going to open up a new level of involvement in individual lives for the Communist Party that we've probably never seen before. And where it really got cemented for me was later that year, we had heard from people that a lot of these technologies were being deployed in Xinjiang, right? There's the region in northwestern China. But by now, I think most people are probably familiar with it. A lot of it's a home to 14 million or so Turkic Uyghurs or Turkic Muslim minorities, and so we heard about this technology being rolled out there, and so we decided to go check it out. A colleague and I drove a rental car in because we were worried that we might be detected at the airport, so we decided to drive in. And as soon as you cross the border, it was like driving into a dystopian war zone, right? It was just security everywhere, guys, these big SWAT guys carrying assault rifles, and then behind them there were just huge banks of cameras and just security checkpoints every mile, right? And every time you went into town, you had to get checked, and anytime you wanted to go into a public place, and you saw Uyghurs sort of scanning their ID cards and their faces anytime they wanted to go anywhere. And it was just like, it was a level of just sort of suffocating, digitally enhanced scrutiny that it was just, it was actually like, I had a physical reaction to it. I just remember my heart sort of like thumping in my chest every time I had to go through one of these security checkpoints. So when we came back from that, we knew that something really big was happening in China. And I think at the end of doing that series, Liza and I talked, and we both felt that it was the sort of thing that, we really wanted to explore how this was affecting people's lives, and it was something that we felt like we needed the space of a book to do.
All right, now before we in a certain sense, I think Xinjiang is the laboratory where a lot of these technologies sort of get applied politically. But before we turn to Xinjiang and bring Jessica into the conversation, Liza, tell us just a little bit. You've written some rather, I thought they were wonderful and all the more frightening for their wonderfulness, chapters on cities like Hangzhou, where Alibaba, Jack Ma's creation, and many other high-tech companies exist or headquartered. But tell us how it is actually working there before we move to the more nightmarish aspect of it in Xinjiang. Because you wrote those sections of your book.
Yeah, so right when we were beginning, we knew that Xinjiang was going to be a part of our book, but we didn't want that to be the sole thing that the reader would take away about the Chinese surveillance state. Because having been in China, we had spoken to enough Chinese and even to the startups providing surveillance themselves that we knew people found it an alluring and attractive thing in certain places.
Can you all hear her okay? Yes, good, okay. Go ahead.
So right from the start, when we were conceiving the book, when it was in its conception, we decided we were going to profile a city in China that was a smart city, where the same systems used in Xinjiang would be used in this city, but to help the city run more efficiently, to make residents' lives more frictionless. So that's when we decided, should we profile? We looked at a couple of cities, Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Hangzhou, and each of these cities have embraced technology But Hangzhou was really the city that stood out because of a couple of reasons. The first reason was the world's two largest camera makers, CCTV camera makers, were headquartered in the place. So Hikvision and Dahua are China's two largest CCTV makers, and now they sell the most surveillance cameras globally as well.
And aren't most of the surveillance cameras, for instance, in the London Tube, made by Hikvision? Yeah. So I mean, this company is not just limited to China.
Yeah, but that won't be for long because I think yesterday the new incoming UK security minister just said he wants to ban all Hikvision cameras from the UK. There's been like a global pushback against Hikvision, not just in the US, but gradually we're seeing it in Europe as well. But back to Hangzhou, what we saw when we got there was CCTVs and sensors actually making Hangzhou residents' lives so much more efficient in multiple ways. I mean, firstly, it was optimizing traffic. Hangzhou is just that sort of city. Maybe a bit background of Hangzhou. Hangzhou is a wealthy city, probably about 2 hours drive from Shanghai. And the city was also, a historical city, known for like the West Lake, and I think it was a capital at some point as well. So Hangzhou, because of it's also home to Alibaba, and because of the sudden speed of Alibaba's growth and also the growth of other internet industries in Hangzhou, like the city went from 3.6 million people to 11 million people in the space of like 10 years. That meant like the road infrastructure, which was already creaking when you had 3.6 million people, which was really kind of unfunctionable when you had 11. So what Alibaba and the city government did was they synchronized data from CCTV cameras at road intersections, and they used that together with GPS data from cars that are traveling on the street. They used that to optimize traffic lights. So for example, if there was a lot of heavy traffic on one street, the traffic lights would stay green for longer. And it wasn't just for the convenience of ordinary Hangzhou residents. What we saw them do, and actually we interviewed a guy whose own life was impacted by this. What Hangzhou also did was for emergency responders, for first responders like an ambulance or a fire truck, if the fire truck or the ambulance turned on a certain mode in the ambulance, it essentially would have green lights the whole way from from the hospital to its destination. And we spoke to a guy whose mother had fallen into a river in Hangzhou, and when she was fished out by some kindly neighbors, she badly needed to get to the hospital. And the ambulance that came had turned on this function that was linked to the AI system, and it got her to the hospital in 15 minutes, which was half the time it would have usually taken. And it isn't just optimizing traffic, CCTV systems in Hangzhou and the data mining and AI aspect, they also help spot flooding in the city when there's heavy rain, or litter being thrown from high levels of an apartment, and even manhole covers that have gone missing. So there were multiple reasons why people like that system.
Mm-hmm. Josh, I think you wrote that because it was in the section on Xinjiang, the Communist Party's offensive in Xinjiang ranks among the most unsettling political developments of the 21st century. Tell us briefly, what's going on there? Why should we be worried?
Right, well, for people who haven't been following it, essentially, Xinjiang is one of these areas of China that have always been extremely valuable to China, and this actually predates the Communist Party. It's a resource-rich, strategically important place. It's always been a place that Chinese rulers have had real trouble controlling, and that's partly because it has this really diverse population that is not really Chinese. It doesn't really have a huge amount of cultural or linguistic or religious connection to China. And so China's always struggled with this. Partly especially under the Communist Party, the struggle has been that local minority groups, particularly the Uyghurs, have really chafed at the presence of Han Chinese people. The Communist Party has sort of sent like Han migrants to Xinjiang to sort of dilute the Uyghur population, and the Uyghurs resented that, and they saw that, you know, in Kazakhstan, all these other areas that the Soviets controlled, they'd gotten their own countries, right? But China had not given the Uyghurs their own country. So anyway, the tensions go back; they're very deep-seated. And around 2015, 2016, Xi Jinping started to get impatient with the methods that the Communist Party was using to try to exercise greater control in Xinjiang, and so they shifted gears, and they decided that, you know, instead of kind of waiting for Uyghurs to kind of come around to being a part of China, they were going to actively re-engineer Uyghur identity, essentially, to force them to assimilate into Chinese culture. And the way they did that was by building a archipelago of internment camps where they would send Uyghurs to be taught Mandarin, undergo political indoctrination, often be subjected to torture if they were seen as not cooperating enough, and the idea was that they could just this is, you know, brainwashing was a phrase invented in China, xinao, right? Mm-hmm. That's, you know, that they would be able to force Uyghurs into sort of embracing Chinese culture and Chinese politics.
But it should be said, all in the name of anti-terrorism, because there were some terrorist acts that sort of gave them the pretext.
True. Yeah, there was. You know, that's true, and there's a debate in you know, amongst people who sort of study Xinjiang about just to what extent terrorism is a problem there. There has been violence in Xinjiang. I think most of those episodes, when you look at them, have turned out to be sort of spontaneous reactions to sort of heavy-handed policing. But just prior to this sort of shift in China in 2013 and 2014, there were a series of attacks that definitely had more of a sort of terrorist feel to them, including an attack in Beijing and in Kunming. And so I think there was concern in Beijing that Uyghurs in particular were starting to be radicalized in a way that was going to get out of control. And so they set up this camp system, and to fill those camps, they deployed a massive surveillance system, built around a platform that sucked in a lot of data, a lot like in Hangzhou, except for this platform, the purpose was to track and categorize Uyghurs in particular according to how likely they were to resist party rule, right? And those, they were tracked sort of by their faces. Often their phones were scanned. If you're walking down the street in Xinjiang, if you're a Uyghur, the police will wave you over and grab your phone and stick it into a phone scanner, and they'll search your phone for sort of digital contraband that indicates whether you might be sort of have contact with people outside of China, and be in contact with ideas that might radicalize you. And they'll monitor you to see how often you go to the mosque and these sorts of things, and they collect all of that data onto a platform that then they use to make a judgment about what the level of resistance you might display in the future towards the party, and if they decide that level of resistance is too high, they'll send you to a camp.
Mm-hmm. Now, Jessica, in a certain sense, you are really exemplify both the dilemma we confront when we can't go to Xinjiang and we can't really even go to China now easily. And yet, working with ChinaFile, you have found a way to illuminate what's been going on in Xinjiang a bit. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing, what you found.
Sure. Yeah, it's certainly one way. It's not the only way, but we have been working with a lot of procurement documents. And so particularly for the article we wrote, what feels like ages ago now, in 2020, that looked at surveillance in Xinjiang as well as in a few other locations in China. What we were relying on were the government's own purchases of surveillance technology. The disadvantage we have is that we can't go on the ground and check out, like, have all these cameras been installed? We don't know. Or maybe they were installed and no one turned them on. We don't know. But we can get a sense of not only how much the government is spending, who they're buying, what they're buying, but in some cases they'll explain really, say the quiet parts out loud, why they're buying things. So one of the case studies that we focused on was actually in Guangdong province, a town called Xiqiao. And in this document, they had really beautiful graphs, which we didn't have to change, we just translated them. But explaining it's scary when people gather together. We should try to prevent that. Therefore, we're going to set up these systems that indicate when people maybe are gathering too dense of a crowd, or someone has crossed a county, provincial, whatever border, someone who from the outside has come in. Those people deserve more watching. So that's one way that we're able to kind of, given our limitations, track what's going on.
Now, would you two say, who've written this book, would you say that, China has spoken rather glibly about developing a model? Whether it's economic or other kinds of models for export. How would you say they're doing in this process? And how big is the market abroad? I guess it was you, Lisa. Did you do the section on Uganda and Josh and Museveni? So do you think, what do you think they're up to here? Are they trying to have a nice package you can just buy off the shelf and plug into your country and have an economy, have a surveillance system, have the whole package?
Right. I think they're sort of up to two things, right? I think in terms of China itself, right, what they ultimately want to do, what the Communist Party's theory is that if you collect enough data, and China, I don't know how much we need, maybe people already know this, but the amount of data that China has, that the Communist Party has to hand is really astonishing. Just in terms of, take mobile payment systems, right? What people spend money on is probably one of the most reliable indicators of what they really care about.
And where they are.
And where they are, that you can have, right? And in China, they have the mobile payment systems, that people just use on their phone through, people might have heard of WeChat, Alipay, these systems that just make it really easy to buy anything with a scan of a QR code. They do 10 times the transaction volume every year as MasterCard does globally, right? Just trillions of dollars or hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of transactions. And the Chinese government has essentially direct access to any of that data whenever it wants it, right? And that's just an amazing repository of information about human behavior. And so the Communist Party's theory is that they can mine that pool of data with the right AI tools and not just detect problems or threats, conflicts, crimes, but possibly predict them before they happen. And so this is just like in Xinjiang, where they're trying to predict terrorist behavior or predict political resistance among Uyghurs. They think they can predict all sorts of things. And that this is basically a model, or this is a system that is even more responsive than democracy, right?
Now, how do you mean more responsive? It can respond to the state's needs, but also to the people's needs, but sometimes there's a conflict. That's
true. And, the Communist Party, of course, is always worrying itself about contradictions. I think that's one that they will have to figure out. But the theory, at least, is that the advantage of democracy has always been that it's more responsive than authoritarian governments. Never had a famine in a democratic country. China, of course, has had one of the world's worst famines. But now they think with this system, that's no longer that advantage goes away. As far as exporting that idea, they certainly are. Sheena Greetens, who's a scholar at the University of Texas in Austin, did surveyed contracts, sales contracts, and found that there are Chinese state surveillance systems, they market them as safe city systems, being sold, that have been sold, I think, to 80 or more countries globally. That was 2020, so it's probably gone up by now. And that includes, countries in Africa and Latin America, but it also includes, democracies, police departments in Western Europe. So these systems have a lot of appeal. And in certain places, they sell them along with this Chinese idea, right? So in Uganda, we went to Uganda, where the leader there, Yoweri Museveni, a few years ago spent about, I think around $300 million to sort of buy a Chinese state surveillance starter kit, basically.
There was a Canadian competitor who quickly.
There was a Canadian competitor. There was, actually. Yeah. So it's not just China. It's not just China. But one of the reasons that China was able to, that Huawei was the Chinese company that won that contract. One of the reasons they were able to win that contract is because the Chinese embassy, the ambassador there was a pitchman for it. And he arranged for the Ugandan police to travel to China, not only to visit Huawei's headquarters, but to go to the Ministry of Public Security office off of Tiananmen Square, which I know you're familiar with, Orville. But they went to that office, that huge sprawling building, and then they were shown how the Chinese police use these systems. And having seen that, they came back and signed the contract. And then Museveni has since gone on to use that system to track down political opponents, people who protested over the last election. But I think there is a question about whether China is trying to actively export this model, whether like the United States, it thinks its system is one that the rest of the world should adopt. I'm not sure that's the case. Mm-hmm. I think they're happy if people do that, but mostly what they want is to make it okay for governments to use these technologies in whatever way they want, right? I think the main goal is just to sort of undermine this idea that that there should be protections against this sort of technology, and so if governments want to use it in a different way, they're fine with it, as long as as long as it's okay to use them in some way.
And they want to make money.
And they want to make money.
Yeah.
So, to follow up to that, when we were doing the research, we found out that when exporting these models, a lot of it was driven by commercial reasons. Because China has always wanted its tech companies to go global and basically be able to sell not just in China, but to a global market. So, that was one of the reasons kind of pushing China or Chinese officials to be selling these systems, often providing countries buying these systems, which are not cheap because it runs into like hundreds of millions for a complete system. China will often give them, kind of conditions-free loans, just so that they would take it up. And it makes a lot of sense as well, because they also knew that surveillance demand in China would peak out at some point. China has more than 400 million cameras right now. How many more cameras can Hikvision and Dahua sell in China? So to keep the export machine running, to keep Hikvision and Dahua humming, they have to have the model taken up overseas and create overseas demand for these cameras too.
So, Jessica, you are trolling through all of these procurement documents where people are actually paying to buy X, Y, or Z that fits into the surveillance system. I'm wondering if you have any notion of where is all this money coming from to do this in China? This is no small, these are expensive systems, and maintenance is significant too.
Yeah. There's a good question about how much maintenance is going on. We saw evidence in some contracts that they included multi-year agreements for maintenance for a certain number of years, but some of them didn't. So it's not clear how these are being maintained. We saw when we were looking through that the majority of purchasers were in the Public Security Bureau, so that's under the Ministry of Public Security. And as people may or may not know, China spends about as much, maybe slightly more, I don't remember what the latest figures are, on internal security as it does on its national security defense budget. So there is a lot of money sloshing around in China generally for internal security purposes, but it wasn't just public security bureaus. There was a number of other functional hierarchies, bureaucracies that were buying these things. And I thought it was interesting that Communist Party entities, so the Ministry of Public Security is a government entity, it's run by the state. A bunch of public security, or Communist Party entities were buying these too, to supplement what the government was also doing. Like the party wanted to run their own cameras. So I don't know exactly how the funding streams work, but because it's in the Ministry of Public Security ambit, we know that there's a ton of money just generally available for that in China. But we didn't even look at, I mean, our research only looked at what Dr. Mareike Olberg, who was my co-author, and I were calling like the coercive apparatus. So it was only looking at public security, at, various things related to that. It wasn't even looking at things like the Ministry of Education or the Health Ministry, which if we were writing this again now today, we would certainly be focusing on the Health Ministry because that's a big player right now in the surveillance market.
I mean, let me put that question to you, Josh. Where the hell is all this money coming from? I mean, this is an extraordinary thing that China has undertaken.
Right. I mean, it's. I agree with Jessica. It is very difficult to exactly figure out where the income streams are. One thing that was interesting in Xinjiang, and unfortunately we didn't get to fully explore this because a lot of the data got erased before we were able to get to it, which is why the work that Jessica does is so important. But we were looking at.
Namely, she captures it before they can delete it.
Exactly. Yeah, which is really just vital these days, especially almost any reporting you do on China. Just as a short aside, these days, if there's data out there, and there often is, you have to kind of capture it immediately because it will disappear as soon as it can. But in Xinjiang, what was interesting, we were trying to figure out sort of the costs of surveillance, right? Because at a certain point, depending on what your goal is, even sort of relatively efficient, sort of AI-driven surveillance gets too expensive, right? And particularly even if you're looking for a terrorist, like a real terrorist, not just someone who you think might become one, but an actual terrorist. Those terrorists are so hard to find that there was actually a report done in the UK about this. That the amount of money you would have to spend on a surveillance system to actually capture a terrorist before they, to consistently root out and capture terrorists, at a high rate, at like a 90% rate, is so expensive it's basically impossible. So we started looking at how much money was being spent in Xinjiang, and what we realized was the budgets were all over the place. Right, and it was different in different locations. So sometimes it was the Ministry of Public Security building. We were looking at particularly at internment camps and infrastructure surrounding internment camps. Sometimes it was the Ministry of Public Security. Sometimes it was the Education Bureau. Right. Sometimes it was the Ministry of Housing. It was just and the way we could tell it was them is that their budgets would suddenly increase by like 300 or 400 or 600% in 2016 or 2017 when the camps were being built, and then they came back down. So it was really difficult to sort of exactly track how this was being done. But one method they did use for a long time was public-private partnerships. So they were bringing in companies to sort of co-invest in these projects. So essentially, you kind of had.
Well, what's the return?
The return is, I can only really speculate, but I think obviously it's being in the party's good graces. And if you're a surveillance company like SenseTime or Hikvision, what percent is it? Probably like 70, 80% maybe of your revenue comes from public security contracts. So if the party comes to you and says, hey, we need help in Xinjiang, and you're going to have to invest a few $100 million, and you may not get any returns, you might still say yes, because you still want to sell to police elsewhere in more profitable circumstances.
Yeah, and I think, I can speak more broadly for outside of Xinjiang. Outside of Xinjiang, a lot of the money came from, when I talk to people, I understand it comes from a smart city budget. So in the last 10 years, China has been pushing aggressively to digitize its cities, to push 4G, to make cities just more connected to the internet, and to have the internet enable cities to just be more efficient. So this whole smart city push includes making the police force more efficient with high-end technology. So a lot of the money would come under the banner of smart city investment. And often, like, the local governments would have like a budget set aside for this. And the reason why public security tended to be the biggest buyers of these systems, I remember we were at the Interpol conference once, and I met a researcher from a Chinese public security university, and I said, "What's up with these systems?" And he told me, you Western media, you're getting it all wrong. The reason why we want this system is because China's public security is under-resourced. Like, in China, you have one policeman for every 700 citizens. In the US and the UK, the corresponding ratio is 1 to 400. So just to make up, so Chinese police, they're very eager to embrace these systems because they feel that they're fundamentally under-resourced on the human front, and that technology can be like the eyes and the ears in replacement of like human bodies.
But they do have other intermediary levels like the Chengguan, the village, the neighborhood association. I mean, there are a lot of other minders in this system than just the police.
Yeah, but the Chengguan's kind of, I guess their scope is also limited to like street enforcement with, street hawkers and like rubbish trash in the street. When it comes to, drug suspects or robberies and such, it really does fall down to public security.
Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, this whole surveillance system, of course, depends on technology. And technology we've come to think of as being a rather global enterprise. How do you all think decoupling, which seems to be happening to some degree and could advance very quickly if there's some conflict in the South China Sea, Taiwan, wherever. How do you think that's going to affect this? I mean, already there are many companies, many governments which don't allow purchases of high-tech stuff from China, whether it's Huawei or Hikvision or whatever. How do you think that's going to shake out? Are we going to end up with two technological sort of universes?
So one thing we found out while researching this book was U.S. technology, particularly cutting-edge technology, is very crucial to the smooth running of the Chinese surveillance state. And decoupling would mean you could actually potentially cripple the Chinese surveillance state, because a lot of the AI cameras are run on, a lot of the AI cameras basically rely on a new method of artificial intelligence called deep learning. And deep learning is often powered by very powerful chips made by American companies such as NVIDIA or Intel.
Are they very low nanometer chips that they can't yet make, or are they high legacy chips?
Sorry.
The low nanometer, small nanometer chips.
Yeah, I mean.
So it's not about the nanometer, it's about how fast the processing power is. And in this case, like graphic processing chips, GPUs, graphic processing units, are like the holy grail when it comes to deep learning. They used to be used for gaming, and then in 2009, Andrew Ng, which I think back he's now at Stanford, but back then maybe Google, he discovered that you could use that particular gaming chip to actually accelerate the processing of AI and the training of these algorithms to make them much better in a much faster time.
So that's the NVIDIA thing that just got.
So that allowed the commercialization of AI. Before that, AI was always something that was more theoretical, something that was a PhD project, but never really implemented in real life. So back to the decoupling point, I think there's been a lot of effort by the US administration to decouple American technology away from the Chinese surveillance state. The issue is there are also a lot of loopholes. And I'll give you an example. SenseTime, which is a company that Josh has talked about and the company that we first visited when we were starting this out. SenseTime is China's most valuable AI surveillance company. It's currently listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. SenseTime, at the point of, we know at the point of our reporting, in the early years of reporting, they used a lot of chips from NVIDIA. A lot of the high-end chips came from NVIDIA. They were backed by Qualcomm, which is another US chip maker. They were put on the entity list the Commerce Department trade blacklist a couple of years back. But we know now that even despite being on the entity list, which means you're essentially blocked out from any high-end technology, the company has to get a license to sell to you. We know now that despite being on the entity list, SenseTime was still purchasing large amounts from U.S. tech companies. And the reason why they were doing this was a loophole. Essentially, the Beijing entity of SenseTime was put on the entity list. So if you were SenseTime and you had a Hong Kong entity or a Shanghai entity, it didn't stop you from continuing to buy these products. And then we saw efforts to kind of stem the flow of investment into SenseTime also fall apart. So I'll take you back to the end of last year when SenseTime was about to list the shares on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. There was news just days before the listing that the U.S. had put SenseTime on an investment blacklist. This was run by the Treasury Department. And being on this investment blacklist essentially meant that no U.S. investor could trade SenseTime shares. And we knew from our early reporting that a lot of SenseTime's early investors were U.S. companies such as IDG Capital. In the later stages, they had Fidelity Capital come in, they had Silver Lake Capital. All these are American companies. So that kind of meant that they wouldn't be able to hold SenseTime shares. But then again, you had the loophole of where the company was incorporated. Because the Cayman Islands entity was being listed in Hong Kong, and the Hong Kong entity of SenseTime was being put on the investment blacklist, that meant that U.S. investors did not have to sell out. So SenseTime's IPO continued. It rose 23% on the first day, and U.S. investors made a ton of money from it.
So let me ask you all two questions. First, do you see this as this sort of the use of surveillance and technology for sort of autocratic purposes as a deep and threatening contradiction between China and much of the rest of the world? And then I want you to answer the question of, if you do, to what degree should we be trading with China at all? But let's start with you, Jessica. How much of a contradiction do you think what this whole system we're talking about poses to, I don't want to call it the free world, but one day was called that?
That's a really big question. I think when I think about this question, the way that I frame it is not that there's some giant maw of surveillance need that only exists in China. It exists here too. And we have just chosen to give all our data for free to companies instead of to a government. That's problematic in a number of ways, one of which is Google doesn't have a police force. But surveillance does exist here, and as Josh and Liza wrote in their book, there's deep flaws in it here as well. So I don't know that I see surveillance or surveillance technology itself as the deep and abiding threat that is dividing China from the rest of the world. It's more actually it's again, going back to your book, which is really great, everybody should get it. It's the way that you guys describe it as kind of a systems engineering problem. So it's not the surveillance itself, it's the way that it's thought of. Here, I feel like, you have your random New York City Police Department trying to solve a problem. They're getting a thing, they want to find the guy, fine. In China, there is it seems like there's a larger theory at play here, which is, can we remold citizen behavior in a wide variety of ways to make the citizenry more accommodating to the ruling elite? And so I feel like that is actually the problem. That is the big difference, not necessarily surveillance itself.
And how big a threat do you think, should Americans worry about this? What the hell? China's doing what it's doing. Should we worry about it?
I think to the extent to which it does affect behavior here, it doesn't stay there, right? We hear stories all the time about how people are censoring themselves because of what they say online can be viewed back in China and can cause repercussions to them here in the U.S. or to their families back home. I think it is a concern. I don't have an amazing answer for how we should deal with it.
How do you look at it? You've written this book. When you go to bed at night, what do you think the threat level is from what you've just presented to us?
Yeah, so I actually feel like other governments, not just China, they're dealing with the same issue, right? How do we regulate AI in the use of like law enforcement so that we don't go beyond the boundaries of necessity and proportionality? The difference between China and the rest of the world is I think there's actually a conversation going on in the rest of the world how we should be regulating these things. And it's particularly advanced in the UK and Europe. So in the UK, they have a camera commissioner, and I believe they just changed their name to biometrics commissioner, that actually goes around to make sure that companies and law enforcement agencies, they're using surveillance cameras in the ways that the code of conduct in the UK actually requires them to. So in a way, there's like a safeguard or a check and balance in the UK. And the EU has also done a lot of thinking about it. The European Union had a draft AI regulation out last year, essentially banning real-time AI in police, in public safety. So, I mean, in China, you haven't even got that conversation going. So that is kind of what worries me.
But should we, I mean, let's say there is a school of thought that says what they do in China is what they do in China. Just let them do it. Do you think there's a spillover into the rest of the world that we need to be concerned about?
I mean, one thing that Josh and I found out while researching the book was, this China model is not that easily exportable. Mm-hmm. Yes, you can sell these systems overseas, but can the systems work as well as they do in China? That's a different question. Mm-hmm. Like China has a lot going for it to be able to create this perfect surveillance state. Every citizen has an ID number, and the ID number is linked to your face. Mm-hmm. For example, in Africa, when they tried to sell systems there, we spoke to academics and people on the ground in Africa, and they said, the same thing couldn't happen. I mean, number one, a lot of African countries don't require citizens to have an ID number. So how do you identify individuals if you only have their face, but no corresponding ID number to know where they lived or who they are, or what their name is? So even that, that was already strike one. And strike two was, the Chinese AI algorithm that was so good at facial recognition for Han Chinese and also maybe the ethnic minorities just didn't work well with African faces. It's a completely new data set. It's a completely new training that was required. So yes, I think it's quite worrying that these models are being sold overseas, but at the same time, there's so many different dynamics that make China, capable of running these effectively that other countries cannot.
So, Josh, how do you see it? If you factor in this tech question, the surveillance question, we are in what kind of a war?
Right. Well, I don't. The idea of a new tech Cold War is. I mean, it's an interesting concept, right? I think, it strikes me whenever we have these conversations that we keep falling back on 20th century language, mm-hmm. right? And that's inevitable. I mean, that's because what's happening now is new, and we just don't have a language to describe it. And I'll say right now, I'm not sure I actually have that language either, right? But I think you also see this in Xinjiang, right, where there's a debate about whether what's happening there is a genocide, mm-hmm. right? And
the UN Human Rights Commission said it might be a genocide.
Well, they said it might be crimes against humanity. They actually, for those who might not be aware, the UN Human Rights Commission recently came out with a very long delayed and highly anticipated report that China was trying to quash
after Michelle Bachelet went to Xinjiang.
Right. First time a UN Human Rights Commissioner visited Xinjiang in ever, I think. And their finding was that which for them is actually quite a noteworthy finding, is that China may have committed crimes against humanity. But there's this big debate, within Western governments and even amongst human rights groups about whether you should call it a genocide. And I think part of that debate comes down to the fact that we don't have language to describe what China is doing in Xinjiang, right? It's old, obviously we all know about religious minorities being sent to internment camps, But the way that they're approaching it, their goals, the tools they're using are different now. And we just don't know what to call that. So I think that's part of the difficulty when we're trying to make sense of what's happening, the meaning of what China's doing. I do think, Liza's right in that it is actually very difficult for anyone to replicate China's model, and that's true economically as well as technologically, right? But what I do think China is capable of doing, and what I think if you live in a democracy, you should be concerned about is its ability to reset norms, right? To affect what is considered acceptable for governments to do, or what are considered acceptable uses of technology. And in the United States, Jessica alluded to this, but I think you can see this, right? In the sense that one big issue that is going to become a big issue in the United States with the now that Roe has been overturned, is states where abortion is illegal. Police now have the ability; they can get a search warrant and go to Google and get what's called a ring fence warrant, which is where they say, give us all the information you have on people who are at this abortion clinic at this period of time. Or they have keyword warrants, right, where police can go to Google and say, tell us who searched for, this abortion drug, in this area at this time, right? And so, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. And what they could do, there's data brokers who also they collect data from period tracking apps that they will sell to police. And so it's not exactly like China, right? Because there's rule of law, there are all these things. But when the laws change, these technologies and these techniques, they kind of have authoritarian end results kind of built into them, right? The way that the technologies work, the way that, AI is a black box, right? The way that algorithms come to their decisions, you don't know. Even the people who write algorithms don't know how these systems really work. You just have to accept their conclusions, right? And so I think the technology itself kind of lends itself to authoritarian ends, and it's a thing that people who live in democracies need to think about. We need to think about what the democratic model is in terms of using these technologies, using them in the positive, for the positive ends that we can get out of them, but also figuring out ways to limit the potential damage.
So, besides healing ourselves and making our own democracy work better, given what you've just written and what you've been researching, Jessica, what's the proper response from the United States in an ideal situation? Let's start with you, Jessica.
Wow. Does anybody else want to field this first? I don't have an ideal response. I feel like the first thing that we need to do is understand and make clearer to everybody how much these technologies have human failings baked in at every level. I think part of the reason that they're so effective is because they have this mystique of infallibility. And I would hope that at least bringing that to light, right, is one way in which people, the citizens, might start to push back on our governments in terms of not allowing these sorts of things to happen, right? You think about all the ways that human failings are baked into these things, just assumptions of what is normal and not normal, in terms of what data is fed into these algorithms, people's desire to have a machine tell you what the right answer is, and then you can just listen to it and you don't have to worry about being responsible for coming up with the answer. The way in which, as you guys wrote, you use these things to confirm for confirmation bias. You ignore things that don't fit in with your current reality and you just use it for the things that confirm what you already think. So I think that getting that out is that sort of information out, which you guys have done really well, I think is a really important first step, because I do think for us here in the U.S., this is going to have to be something that the citizenry takes up en masse. I think this is happening in a lot of ways, in a lot of institutions, at the government level, at the corporate level, and in a lot of ways that we don't even see happening. So I really think a big first step is honestly making clear how pervasive it is and how much it reflects our own human failings.
Yeah. So, I mean, the U.S. has tried quite a lot to stop the Chinese surveillance state in the last couple of years. We've had several companies, Chinese companies, linked to the surveillance system in China, put on trade blacklists or investment bans, lists for investment bans. I think one area that the U.S. could look to do is, and it's actually doing now, is to look for a multilateral way to pressure China into stopping what they're doing in Xinjiang. So in this respect, the UN report is very timely, because with the UN report, it's easier to, instead of one country pointing its finger at another country, you have a bit more of an independent analysis of what's happening in China. The other thing I would probably suggest...
Of course, it's not just happening in Xinjiang. I mean, that's the incubator. It's happened in Tibet. It's happening all over China. And the question is that something that does affect us in some way that we need to be mindful of?
Well, so I would say this. From my research and just looking into the way China reacts to external pressure, the most basic thing the U.S. can do is to, lead the way in how to regulate these technologies. Because when you don't, China kind of pounces on it. And I'll give you an example. After the Capitol riot last year, there were several reports in the papers here in the U.S. I think New York Times definitely one of them. They reported how they interviewed Clearview AI. And the founder was saying, Clearview AI runs like a facial recognition system, helping police and other entities kind of match faces to identities. Often they scrape, social media photos just to match your identity to your face. So the New York Times and a couple of other papers reported that police agencies were turning to Clearview AI's data to figure out who had participated in the Capitol riot. Once that article came out, the very next day, Chinese state media, particularly Global Times, pounced on the report and said, the US is a real hypocrite for pointing fingers at us using facial recognition systems, because here they are, they're using it too. So I think it's really essential and urgent that the US leads the way to show that they can get their act right on regulating these technologies, so it doesn't give China more fodder. That makes sense?
Yes, I think we'd all agree. We should get our act together. But Josh, let me throw the ball back at you. Let's say we get our act together. So what does that beg that we do about what you've just written about? Right.
Well, I think, ultimately the biggest form of support that the U.S. Gives to the surveillance state is through our tech companies. And this goes back to the very beginnings when China was trying to figure out how to censor the internet, like the most basic form of kind of digital control. I think it was in 1999 or was it 2000? It was anyway.
And we thought that internet was a liberating phenomenon.
Right around Bill Clinton's famous line.
Jello remark.
Right, yeah. When he was arguing for China to be led into the WTO, right? I mean, I think some people here have heard this line more times than they want to, but he famously said, arguing for more engagement with China is that if China joins the WTO, the internet will, our internet companies will get in there, and trying to control the internet is like trying to nail Jello to the wall, right? And that was just this mantra for me included. I don't know about you, Orville, but I believed it.
I think we all
and
Kool-Aid.
And so, but at the time, right around that time, companies like Sun Microsystems, Cisco, were in Beijing at China's very first security conference, desperately trying to sell their equipment to the Ministry of Public Security and the Ministry of State Security for their what would later become the Great Firewall. Right. So American companies have been in it from the beginning, and no matter and they've been in it from the beginning of this new era of digital surveillance. Intel helped sort of get one of the more influential video surveillance companies off the ground. we talked about NVIDIA, and those companies, they make a lot of money. They make an immense amount of money in China, and they're not going to. I think what the U.S. government can do if it really cares about this is regulate that, right? Because the companies themselves are never going to stop. And this goes all the way back to IBM in the 1930s selling sort of proto-computers to the Nazis, right? I think it's, American business will always chase profit. They have shareholders, and that's what they're built to do. And so if the U.S. government is really serious about doing something about it, that's where they need to take action. And I think it's really a matter of willpower. There are loopholes. Those loopholes can be closed. But it's not going to come without pain, right? I mean, just recently you alluded to the Commerce Department telling NVIDIA it can't sell its most advanced chips to the Chinese military. And NVIDIA came out and said it's going to cost them, $400 million
for one quarter.
Per quarter. Mm-hmm. That's how much money they're making in China. And NVIDIA is a very successful company, and I'm sure it uses a lot of that money to plow into R&D that then benefits the U.S., right? So it's a very complicated.
Same with Qualcomm.
Exactly. So yeah, I don't think there are any easy answers, and it will cost American companies if the U.S. really wants to take action.
Well, do you come away from your experience of really researching this and understanding how the uses to which a very different kind of political system can put technology, feeling that we do need to rise in a different way to respond, or do you think it just we basically should just mind our own business and mend our own selves?
Well, I agree completely with I think both Jessica and Liza made this point, right? I do think we need to figure out what the alternative is, right? If you're just globally, right? If you're sort of thinking in broad terms, 10, 15 years down the line, what the global political landscape is going to look like. China has given a very clear vision for authoritarian governments. They've said whether or not these other governments can actually follow China, who knows, right? But China has laid out a clear vision, democratic countries are kind of a mess. They're schizophrenic about it. Europe definitely has. Europe is kind of out front with this, and they have a vision. But the U.S. is, even internally, the U.S. doesn't really know what it wants to do. California, San Francisco has implemented a ban on real-time surveillance, but now they're thinking of carving out an exception because they want to crack down on crime. NYPD has almost no restrictions, that's an exaggeration. Has very few restrictions on its use of this sort of stuff, and depending on where you go, each different city has a different approach. I'm optimistic. I think this is one of the few issues that concerns both Democrats and Republicans.
Yeah.
And if you watch, there have been a few congressional hearings where you have people who on Capitol Hill never look at each other, much less agree on anything, suddenly agreeing that this is an issue. So I think there is a conversation going, and I'm hopeful that it will lead somewhere.
Now, isn't it strange that China ends up being the solvent between irreconcilable partisan blocks in our own country? But there's a danger there too. All right, I think we've done the last measure of devotion here. Let's have some questions from you. And I can't see you. But I will try. And I think there's someone with the microphone. Yes.
My name is Wang Yanhao. So I contributed a couple of articles and a report about the surveillance report in China. So in early time, the first report was in late 2008. So I want to mention some, the timeline. So the whole system was created, based on China's, a project called a Golden Sheffield, project by the Public Security Department. That plan was drafted in 1998. The first stage was to, equip computers, internet for all public security offices. So all police officers should be able to work in front of a computer connected with internet. That is the first stage. So the second stage was to connect all the public security offices, put all the affairs, all the personnel they're managing connected as a whole system. So before the Olympics in late 2006, I think it's October 2006, when Zhou Yongkang was the Minister of Public Security. Before Olympics, China began to construct two surveillance systems. One specifically targeting against the drug users, another targeting on they call it critical persons. That means political or socially they identified dangerous people. So a year later, before Olympics, China finished the construction of the dynamic, real-time dynamic surveillance system against people they identified as dangerous, either politically or socially. Socially, like people with mental health problems, petitioners, certain religious group, like people with HIV/AIDS or all type of vulnerable population, were included in that system. So probably in that time, around Olympics, China put like 30 million to 50 million people in a national, database. In a national database, that's my understanding. So the basic technology is, so when the public security system connected everything.
So maybe there's a question in here because I think other people would like to ask questions
okay.
too, but maybe ask our panelists a question.
Yeah, okay. I want to make final points about your question. So look at the future. Look at the future, when, our democracy, either Democrats or Republicans, they're competing, but they don't have the data against the candidates of the opposite parties. But other government might have. So that is is a danger towards the democracy. Okay. So look at the 20 years later, the political candidates, our Supreme Court candidates. So we don't have, the enemies in America don't have, the data, but the other government might have. That is the real problem. Okay, thank you.
Okay, do you not want to ask a question?
I have no question.
Okay, very good. Let's...
This one right here.
Right here?
In the front, I think.
Yes, okay, wherever you are. If you have the mic, speak.
Can you hear me?
Please.
Yeah, there's not enough monitoring in this room that you could see me. But anyway, so my question is also more about the future and where you see the surveillance state evolving. I've done also some research. I'm a research fellow with the German Council on Foreign Relations. And so concepts like city brain and, making things even more refined, reducing the costs. So I'm just curious what you've seen emerging, what's on your, what did you see during your research?
I can take that. I'll go first, and then Liza can fill in. So one of the things I think we discovered that was surprising in researching this book is all the ways that the surveillance system doesn't work. Right? I mean, there are huge sort of gaps in the system, right? And including, in particular, I think Jessica has alluded to this, but the data, the way the data is stored is really fractured. And so even with COVID right now, they have COVID health, the health code apps. Even though that data is sort of is stored kind of locally, right? And so I think one of the big things, I mean, it's a little bit boring and wonky, but one of the big things they are doing right now is spending money on on data storage infrastructure to try to centralize all that data. And once they do that, if they can do that, I think it will be a major leap forward in actual surveillance capabilities. I mean, a bit of an aside, actually, but I mean, in some ways they are doing this, but even if they don't succeed, even if they only partially succeed, I think they will still sort of get where they want to go in a lot of important ways, and that's because all they really need to do is persuade people that this system is working, right? Is to make them think that the Communist Party really is all-seeing, and that will get them halfway there, because people will internalize that, and they already have. And anyone who's lived in China, I think, actually knows that feeling that and people will adjust their behavior accordingly. Liza, do you have?
Yeah, so I guess to add on to what Josh said, I mean, for us, we see the future of the surveillance state heading in the direction of, we think that camera counts would probably peak out, because if you have more than 400 million cameras in China right now, if you think about camera per person, that's probably like one camera to about three-ish people. There's really not that many more cameras you could install in China that haven't been installed. What we do see going forward is better cameras. So a lot of these cameras that are installed in China now might not have AI enabled on them. They're just regular kind of analog cameras that are just feeding video back to a central system. We expect that going forward, you're going to see a lot smarter cameras, so more analytics put into more cameras that are already existing, so upgrading the camera system almost. And the reason why I think the cameras are only going to get smarter and the solution's only going to get better is because if you look at the Chinese patents that are filed for facial recognition in China, 50% of these patents filed last year were designed for the public security space. So you already have facial recognition, image recognition, and all sorts of characteristics recognition for the public security cameras right now, but these are only going to improve because people are working on this. So we expect actually a much smarter camera network going forward.
Okay. Jessica?
I was actually going to say, I think that COVID has provided an incredibly important leap forward already. That is, it's a mental shift in the population that I think is going to be really important for the party going forward. And I was going back and reading this article that we had written 2 years ago, and one of the big points was not so much that the technology itself in use in Xinjiang was so different than elsewhere in China. It was that it was targeting a much larger percentage of the population there, so it just felt much more visible, like you knew you were being watched all the time. And of course now with COVID, 100% of the population is targeted in 100% of the country. And that's a really big shift, I think, for a lot of people. People may have vaguely known they were being watched, they knew there was cameras, blah, 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 but COVID has just made it, the thing in your pocket is the thing that allows you to get into places. It allows you entree into society writ large. And that's been normalized already. And I think that once that mental leap has been taken among citizens, that allows for a lot more things going forward. And that doesn't have anything to do with technology, it just has to do with what people feel is normal.
Yeah, it allowed them to scale up, and at the same time to have justification for doing it so that people didn't feel it was, that it had a public interest motive behind it. Okay, let's see, who else? Right here.
Hi, my name is David Zweig, a retired professor. And my question is really, in the book, I haven't read it, to what extent do you talk about sort of the dark side of Chinese society? I mean, I think the Xinjiang story is something that we're all concerned about, but emphasizing the Xinjiang story or the positive view of Hangzhou, I mean, China has an incredible black society, people underground, crime, all kinds of things that we just don't talk about very much. And you talked about the role of the public security. I mean, there's a reason why they got it. I mean, they also wanted to get dissidents, there's no doubt. But there's a huge problem in Chinese society with gangs and all kind of stuff. And I wonder to what extent this actually helps prevent crimes against common people, violence, all kinds of stuff that, we know goes on. I mean, goes on here, goes on it goes on around the world, and I think it's an important question to ask about the surveillance.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a sort of a piece of the equation in Hangzhou. In the book we don't dive into it in great detail, right? But the advantage of these systems in a place like Hangzhou for people who live there, it definitely involves a sort of public safety element, right? In the book we talk about, there's a system that the Chengguan, whom Orville mentioned, use, and the Chengguan are sort of lower level. I mean, they're not police. They're kind of urban management enforcers, and their job is to keep sidewalks clean, right? But they have systems that, that identify like vagrants or unlicensed vendors and flag them to the Chengguan, and the same thing happens with police, right? I mean, they have the police have systems that identify different types of people who the government considers a public safety threat. But I think what's interesting is when you look at the categories of those people, right? You have major criminals, right? You have ex-cons, you have criminal suspects, you have drug users, but then you also have the mentally ill, and you have people. There's a whole category for people who threaten social stability, right? And so, absolutely, these systems are being used to track down genuine bad guys. But the lines get really blurry out on the edges in terms of who is considered a bad guy. And I think that's sort of why. I mean, that's our focus. I think that's and that's very clear in Xinjiang, of course. But yeah, and I think in China, China actually has, relatively speaking, not that much crime, right? I mean, it was already a very safe place before these systems were implemented, right? I mean, there's no mass shootings. I would have no compunction whatsoever about sending my mother, when she visited, out walking on the streets of Beijing late at night by herself, because it was just a safe city, and this was years ago. So I think that's definitely an attractive element for a lot of Chinese people of these systems, but I also think that there are these other considerations.
And it's also very hard to ascertain how effective the system has been, cracking down on crime, just because there's no reliable data. There's a lot of opaqueness surrounding the system. Like, the police will not open up their systems for independent assessment, obviously, and you can't really trust the numbers in state media either. So, when it came to really ascertaining like how effective it was tough.
It's not an open society. All right, I think we have time for one more question. Let's see. Yes, in the back there.
Hi. Thank you for the wonderful book. It seems that we currently have two choices here right now, which is the status quo of doing little to nothing, and then the second one, which is decoupling. Do you see an alternative to decoupling? Is engagement possible, and what do you see? What would that look like?
Let's take that one. I honestly don't know. I think I might bring Orville into this one, since he was around for the heyday of the engagement era. I was raised in the engagement era. I sort of went to China on a high school exchange trip in 1993 that I think was the first of its kind. So I always hope that there is room for engagement. It's just my background. On this, I think it's tough, right? I don't. What would engagement look like, right? These are, in some ways, the way that the Communist Party is using these systems is just so fundamentally different from at least the way that I think most democracies see themselves in an ideal sense. Xinjiang, I think, is a good example, right, where I think that they dug their heels in. There was massive, just global opposition to what they were doing in Xinjiang, including from some places like Turkey, where the China normally sees as friendly, and Xi Jinping came out a year and a half ago, and said, very publicly, our policies in Xinjiang are correct, right? And so I think it's very hard to have a conversation on these sorts of topics. I don't know if others have ideas, but
Liza?
Yeah, like Josh said, it is a tough question. I think for me, it boils down still to the same argument of we need a global standard of how we treat such technologies, such new technologies, because I don't think China wants to be seen as like a responsible world player as well. And without that global standard kind of laying the foundation of how you can use it and to what extent you can push such technologies, it's just, I guess China is in a way running amok. So it would be good, I guess, as a third alternative, to work together, discuss with not just democracies and Western nations, but to bring China to the table and maybe Russia to the table and talk about how these technologies can be used and regulated. That's, of course, my pipe dream, but that's probably one method.
Jessica.
I guess I'm not sure what decoupling really means, honestly, because the relationship is so complicated. We have so many entanglements and relationships, and I think that levying export controls on, for example, certain kinds of chips or this or that shouldn't mean that other sorts of exchanges can't go forward. So I guess the question really is like, what is decoupling? I don't think it serves anyone's interests, particularly not the people here and not the people in China, if we don't have any sort of exchange, contact, trade at all. That's just not good for anyone. That said, I think that the path that we had been on previously of, well, we'll just keep trading and then it'll eventually all work out, like that clearly didn't work. So there needs to be some sort of tacking, but a complete decoupling, if whatever that means, I just don't think is desirable or really possible.
Well, maybe just as a thank you all. That is a quick epitaph. I just got back from Taiwan, and one of the questions we asked a lot of people, particularly the nationalists, the Kuomintang, who like to talk with the mainland and keep channels open, we said, what distinguishes you from from the other party that's in power? And they said, well, we believe in talking, in dialogue. So then we asked, well, what kind of a solution could you imagine the Chinese Communist Party agreeing to now? And they couldn't think of anything. So I think, sadly, we are at a place where we should keep the door open. But where I can't really imagine what a new status quo would look like. And I think your book makes me even less optimistic about that. So thank you. And thank you all for coming.